When Scott Kelly returned to Earth after 340 days aboard the International Space Station, his optic nerves had swollen, the shape of his eyeballs had changed, and the fluid pressure inside his skull had increased by a measurable amount. This wasn't speculation. NASA documented it with MRI scans, optical coherence tomography, and direct measurement of cerebrospinal fluid dynamics. What Kelly experienced wasn't an anomaly. It's a pattern observed in approximately 70% of astronauts who spend more than 6 months in microgravity. The mechanism is understood, the progression is documented, and the timeline is consistent. This condition, now called Spaceflight-Associated Neuro-ocular Syndrome, or SANS, represents the first critical physiological system to show irreversible structural changes in deep space. It happens faster than bone loss, faster than muscle atrophy, and unlike radiation damage, it begins immediately upon entering microgravity and worsens continuously without intervention. This isn't about distant hypotheticals. The evidence comes from 6 decades of spaceflight, from Mercury astronauts reporting visual disturbances to ISS crew members showing measurable optic disc edema after just 3 months in orbit. The data is peer-reviewed, published in journals like JAMA Ophthalmology and The Lancet Neurology, and backed by controlled studies comparing astronauts before and after flight. The International Space Station has served as a laboratory for human physiology in microgravity, and the results are unambiguous. The cardiovascular and fluid regulatory systems, specifically how they manage blood distribution and intracranial pressure, fail to adapt to the absence of gravity. They don't gradually adjust. They begin failing within hours, and the consequences compound over months. If you enjoy this kind of evidence-based content, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. There are many other videos on the channel built the same way, and if this topic interests you, you'll likely enjoy what's already there. Understanding why this happens requires understanding what gravity does to the human body every moment you're standing, sitting, or lying down on Earth. Gravity isn't just a force that keeps you on the ground. It's a constant mechanical stress that shapes how every fluid system in your body operates. Your heart doesn't pump blood into a neutral environment. It pumps against a gravitational gradient. When you stand, roughly 1.4 liters of blood shifts from your upper body into your legs and lower abdomen. This isn't a choice your body makes. It's a physical consequence of hydrostatic pressure, the same principle that makes water pressure increase with depth in the ocean. To counteract this, your cardiovascular system has evolved a suite of mechanisms. Veins in your legs contain one-way valves that prevent blood from pooling. When you walk, your leg muscles compress these veins, forcing blood upward. This is called the skeletal muscle pump, and it's essential. Without it, standing still for extended periods causes blood to accumulate in the lower extremities, reducing venous return to the heart and lowering cardiac output. This is why soldiers standing at attention sometimes faint. Their muscle pump isn't active, blood pools in their legs, and cerebral perfusion drops below the threshold needed to maintain consciousness. Your autonomic nervous system monitors blood pressure continuously through baroreceptors located in the carotid arteries and aortic arch. When you stand up quickly, blood pressure in your head drops. The baroreceptors detect this within a fraction of a second and trigger a compensatory response. Heart rate increases, blood vessels in the limbs constrict, and within 2 to 3 heartbeats, blood pressure stabilizes. This response is so fast and so reliable that you rarely notice it. But it's a response, not a passive state. Your body is constantly working against gravity to keep your brain perfused with oxygenated blood. In microgravity, this entire system becomes obsolete. There's no hydrostatic gradient. Blood doesn't pool in your legs because there's no down. Within the first few hours of entering orbit, approximately 1.5 to 2 liters of blood that would normally reside in the lower body redistributes toward the chest and head. This has been measured repeatedly using bioimpedance sensors, ultrasound imaging of the jugular veins, and direct observation. Astronauts report a sensation of fullness in the head, nasal congestion, and facial puffiness. Ground-based studies using head-down bed rest, where subjects lie with their heads tilted 6 degrees below horizontal for weeks or months, reproduce these symptoms. The tilt simulates the fluid shift without requiring actual spaceflight, and the cardiovascular changes observed in bed rest subjects closely match those seen in orbit. The body interprets this fluid shift as hypervolemia, an excess of blood volume. The kidneys respond by excreting more water, reducing total blood volume by approximately 10 to 15% over the first few days in space. This is an adaptive response on Earth. If you consumed excess water or had a transfusion, your kidneys would adjust your blood volume to maintain homeostasis. But in microgravity, the signal is false. The body isn't overloaded with fluid. Fluid is simply distributed differently. The kidneys reduce blood volume based on signals from the chest, and the result is a new equilibrium, one where total blood volume is lower but the distribution is fundamentally altered. This redistribution doesn't just affect how you feel, it changes the mechanical environment inside your skull. The human brain is suspended in cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, a clear liquid that provides buoyancy and cushioning. CSF is produced continuously by structures called choroid plexuses, located in the ventricles of the brain, at a rate of approximately 500 milliliters per day. It circulates through the ventricular system, flows around the brain and spinal cord, and is reabsorbed into the venous bloodstream through arachnoid granulations, small valve-like structures that project into the superior sagittal sinus, a large vein running along the top of the brain. On Earth, CSF pressure in the lumbar spine, measured during a spinal tap with the patient lying on their side, averages 10 to 15 centimeters of water. This is a mechanical equilibrium. CSF production, circulation, and reabsorption balance each other under the influence of gravity. The venous system that drains CSF is part of the same cardiovascular network that experiences hydrostatic pressure gradients. When you stand, venous pressure in your head is lower than when you lie down, and CSF reabsorption adjusts accordingly. When you lie flat, venous pressure increases slightly, and CSF pressure increases in parallel. In microgravity, venous pressure in the head increases significantly because there's no gravitational gradient pulling blood away from the skull. The jugular veins, which normally drain blood from the brain, become engorged. Ultrasound imaging of astronauts in orbit shows measurable distension of the internal jugular veins and increased flow resistance. Ground-based analog studies using long-duration head-down tilt have documented similar changes. When venous pressure in the head increases, the pressure gradient that drives CSF reabsorption decreases. CSF continues to be produced at the same rate, but reabsorption becomes less efficient. The result is an increase in intracranial pressure. This increase has been measured. NASA conducted a study using non-invasive techniques, including ocular ultrasound and measurement of optic nerve sheath diameter, a surrogate marker for intracranial pressure. The data showed that astronauts on the ISS had consistently elevated intracranial pressure compared to pre-flight baselines. The elevation wasn't extreme, typically in the range of 3 to 5 millimeters of mercury above normal, but it was persistent. It didn't resolve. As long as astronauts remained in microgravity, the pressure stayed elevated. Elevated intracranial pressure has direct consequences for the optic nerve. The optic nerve exits the back of the eye through a structure called the optic disc, a small circular area where retinal ganglion cell axons converge and pass through the sclera, the white outer layer of the eye. The optic nerve is surrounded by a sheath that's continuous with the meninges covering the brain, and this sheath is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. When CSF pressure increases, the pressure in the optic nerve sheath increases. The optic disc, which is mechanically compliant, swells. This swelling, called papilledema when caused by increased intracranial pressure on Earth, pushes the surface of the optic disc forward, distorting the normal architecture of the retina at that location. Ophthalmologic examinations of astronauts using fundoscopy, optical coherence tomography, and OCT imaging have documented optic disc edema in a majority of long-duration crew members. The edema isn't subtle. OCT scans show measurable increases in the thickness of the retinal nerve fiber layer, quantified in micrometers. The swelling compresses the small blood vessels that supply the optic nerve, and in some cases, cottonwool spots, small areas of retinal ischemia, appear on the retinal surface. These are visible on examination and represent localized damage to the nerve fiber layer. The globe of the eye also changes shape. The eyeball isn't perfectly spherical. It's slightly elongated, and its shape is maintained by intraocular pressure, the fluid pressure inside the eye, balanced against the elastic tension of the sclera. In microgravity, the mechanical forces acting on the posterior wall of the eye change. Increased CSF pressure in the optic nerve sheath exerts force on the back of the eye, flattening the posterior globe. This has been measured with MRI. Studies comparing pre-flight and post-flight imaging show a flattening of the posterior sclera and, in some astronauts, the development of small outpouchings of the scleral wall called posterior globe protrusions. These structural changes alter the optical geometry of the eye, shifting the focal point and causing hyperopic shifts, a form of farsightedness. Scott Kelly's visual acuity degraded during his mission. Before flight, his vision was normal. After 340 days, he required corrective lenses for close work. His case is documented, but it's not unique. Approximately 29% of short-duration shuttle astronauts and nearly 60% of long-duration ISS astronauts have reported changes in visual acuity during or after spaceflight. Post-flight examinations have confirmed corresponding structural changes in a significant fraction of these individuals. Some of the changes, particularly optic disc edema, resolve after return to Earth. Others, including posterior globe flattening and choroidal folds, small wrinkles in the vascular layer beneath the retina, persist for months or longer. In a small number of cases, the changes appear to be permanent. This isn't bone loss, which can be mitigated with exercise. It isn't muscle atrophy, which responds to resistance training. The cardiovascular system's failure to manage intracranial pressure and microgravity is a central regulatory problem, not a disuse problem. Astronauts on the ISS exercise 2 hours per day using resistance devices and treadmills. This exercise maintains muscle mass and reduces bone density loss, but it doesn't prevent SANS. The fluid shift happens regardless of physical activity because it's a consequence of the absence of gravity itself, not a consequence of inactivity. The timeline matters. Bone density decreases at a rate of approximately 1 to 2% per month in microgravity, concentrated in weight-bearing bones like the hips and spine. Muscle atrophy follows a similar curve, with losses of 10 to 15% in leg muscle mass over 6 months, mitigated partially by exercise. But changes in intracranial pressure and optic nerve swelling begin within days to weeks. Michael Barrett, a physician astronaut who spent 6 months on the ISS, reported visual changes within the first month. Imaging studies of other crew members have shown detectable optic disc edema as early as 3 weeks into a mission. The onset is rapid, and the progression is continuous. Radiation exposure, often cited as a primary deep space hazard, accumulates over time but doesn't cause immediate functional impairment. Astronauts on the ISS receive an average dose of approximately 150 millisieverts per year, roughly 50 times the annual dose a person on Earth receives from natural background radiation. This increases cancer risk over a lifetime, but the increase is probabilistic and delayed. There's no immediate loss of function. SANS, by contrast, impairs vision, a critical sense, within weeks, and the impairment can worsen indefinitely if the exposure continues. The cardiovascular system's role extends beyond fluid distribution. The heart itself adapts to microgravity, and not in a beneficial way. On Earth, your heart works against gravity to pump blood upward to your brain. Cardiac muscle, like skeletal muscle, responds to mechanical load. When the load decreases, the muscle atrophies. Studies using echocardiography, ultrasound imaging of the heart, have shown that astronauts experience a reduction in left ventricular mass, the thick muscular wall of the heart's main pumping chamber, by approximately 10% after 6 months in space. The heart becomes smaller and weaker because it doesn't need to work as hard. This adaptation creates a problem upon return to Earth. When astronauts land, gravity reasserts itself immediately. Blood pools in the legs, venous return drops, and the heart, now smaller and weaker, struggles to maintain adequate blood pressure. This is called orthostatic intolerance. NASA has documented cases of astronauts being unable to stand for more than a few minutes after landing without experiencing dizziness, lightheadedness, or syncope, a temporary loss of consciousness due to inadequate cerebral blood flow. The baroreceptor reflexes that normally stabilize blood pressure are blunted after spaceflight. The cardiovascular system has deconditioned, and it takes days to weeks to recondition after return. Orthostatic intolerance is manageable on Earth because astronauts can sit, lie down, and gradually readapt. But on a mission to Mars, there's no immediate return option. A crew landing on Mars after a 6 to 9 month transit would face Martian gravity, approximately 38% of Earth's gravity. This is stronger than microgravity but still far weaker than Earth. Whether 38% gravity is sufficient to prevent the progression of SANS or to allow cardiovascular reconditioning is unknown. There are no experimental data because no human has ever experienced 0.38 g for an extended period. The only data points we have are 0 g on the ISS and 1 g on Earth. Lunar gravity is 16.5% of Earth's, and the Apollo astronauts spent at most 3 days on the Moon, far too short to assess chronic adaptation. The absence of intermediate data is a significant gap. Rotating spacecraft that generate artificial gravity through centrifugal force have been proposed since the 1950s, but none have been built for human occupancy. Ground-based centrifuge studies have tested short-radius rotation at varying G levels, but these simulate gravity for minutes to hours, not months. The physiological response to sustained intermediate gravity is one of the most important unknowns in human spaceflight. Until it's tested, we can't predict whether Martian gravity is protective, neutral, or merely slows the deterioration seen in microgravity. The fluid shift problem isn't purely passive. The body has active regulatory systems for fluid balance, and they malfunction in microgravity. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RAS, is a hormonal cascade that regulates blood pressure and fluid volume. When blood pressure drops or when the kidneys detect reduced blood flow, they release renin, an enzyme that initiates a series of reactions leading to the production of angiotensin II, a powerful vasoconstrictor, and aldosterone, a hormone that promotes sodium retention. This system is exquisitely sensitive. It responds to changes in posture, hydration, and blood volume within minutes. In microgravity, the RAS is suppressed. The kidneys, sensing increased central blood volume due to the headward fluid shift, reduce renin secretion. Aldosterone levels drop, and sodium excretion increases. The result is a reduction in total body water and sodium, compounding the reduction in blood volume. This suppression persists as long as the microgravity environment persists. It's not an acute adjustment that stabilizes. It's a chronic shift to a new regulatory set point, one that's adaptive in space but maladaptive on return to gravity. Atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP, is another hormone involved in fluid regulation. It's released by cells in the atria of the heart in response to atrial stretch, which occurs when blood volume increases. ANP promotes sodium and water excretion by the kidneys, reducing blood volume. In microgravity, atrial stretch increases immediately due to the fluid shift, and ANP secretion increases. This contributes to the rapid diuresis, excessive urination, that astronauts experience in the first few days of spaceflight. Studies measuring ANP levels in astronauts have confirmed this response. The hormone levels remain elevated as long as central blood volume remains elevated, which is the entire duration of the mission. The interplay of these systems creates a vicious cycle. Increased central venous pressure elevates intracranial pressure. Elevated intracranial pressure causes optic nerve swelling and visual changes. The body interprets the increased central blood volume as a signal to reduce total blood volume, which it does, but the redistribution persists. The cardiovascular system downregulates, the heart weakens, and the venous system in the head remains engorged. There's no feedback mechanism that corrects the core problem because the core problem is the absence of gravity, and the body has no evolutionary experience with that environment. NASA has tested several countermeasures. Lower body negative pressure devices, which use suction to draw blood into the legs, have been used on the ISS to simulate the fluid distribution of standing on Earth. These devices can temporarily reduce the headward fluid shift and have been shown to lower intracranial pressure during use. But they're not practical for continuous use. Astronauts can't work while wearing a negative pressure device for hours at a time. The effect is transient. As soon as the device is removed, the fluid shift returns. Compression garments, similar to the anti-G suits worn by fighter pilots, have also been tested. These garments apply pressure to the legs and lower abdomen, reducing venous pooling. In microgravity, they don't have pooling to prevent, but they can alter the distribution of blood by applying external pressure. Studies have shown modest effects on cardiovascular parameters, but they don't prevent SANS. The mechanism of SANS isn't simply fluid shift. It's the sustained increase in intracranial venous pressure, and compression garments don't address that. Pharmaceutical interventions have been considered. Diuretics, which increase urine production, could theoretically reduce CSF production or lower intracranial pressure by reducing overall fluid volume. But astronauts are already hypovolemic in space. Reducing blood volume further could worsen orthostatic intolerance and impair cardiovascular function. Carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, drugs that reduce CSF production, are used on Earth to treat idiopathic intracranial hypertension, a condition where CSF pressure is chronically elevated without an obvious cause. These drugs have been discussed as potential countermeasures for SANS, but they haven't been tested in spaceflight. The risk is that reducing CSF production without addressing the underlying venous congestion could cause unpredictable changes in brain physiology. The most effective countermeasure remains artificial gravity. A rotating spacecraft or a centrifuge on board a spacecraft could generate a gravitational gradient, restoring the hydrostatic pressure differences that the cardiovascular system evolved to manage. The required rotation rate depends on the radius of rotation. For a comfortable artificial gravity environment, minimizing Coriolis effects that cause disorientation and nausea, a radius of at least 10 meters is desirable, with a rotation rate of around 4 to 6 revolutions per minute to generate 1 g at the rim. Smaller radii require faster rotation, increasing Coriolis forces. Studies on short radius centrifuges have shown that humans can adapt to rotation rates up to 23 revolutions per minute for brief periods, but sustained exposure at high rotation rates causes persistent motion sickness and spatial disorientation. No crewed spacecraft with artificial gravity has been built because the engineering challenges are substantial. A rotating spacecraft requires either a tethered design, where two modules are connected by a cable and spun around a common center of mass, or a rotating wheel structure. Both designs require precise balance, active stabilization, and mechanisms to transfer crew and equipment between the rotating and non-rotating sections. The structural loads on a rotating tether during thrust maneuvers are complex, and a failure of the tether or rotation mechanism could be catastrophic. Despite these challenges, artificial gravity remains the only countermeasure that addresses the root cause of SANS by restoring a gravitational environment. The data on SANS come from missions in low Earth orbit, where astronauts are in microgravity but still within Earth's magnetosphere, which provides partial protection from cosmic radiation, and where resupply missions arrive every few months. Deep space missions, beyond the Van Allen belts, expose crews to higher radiation levels and eliminate the possibility of rapid resupply or evacuation. The combination of SANS progression and radiation exposure compounds the risk. Vision impairment affects the ability to perform critical tasks like piloting, equipment repair, and navigation. If multiple crew members experience significant visual degradation simultaneously, mission safety is compromised. A Mars mission timeline illustrates the problem. A typical conjunction-class mission, using efficient Hohmann transfer orbits, requires approximately 6 to 9 months for the outbound transit, 500 days on the Martian surface, and another 6 to 9 months for the return. Total mission duration is roughly 900 days, or 30 months. Based on current ISS data, nearly all crew members would experience some degree of SANS during the transits. Whether the Martian surface phase, with 0.38 g, allows for recovery or merely slows progression is unknown. If SANS continues to worsen on Mars, crew members could return to Earth with severe, potentially permanent visual impairment. The optic nerve damage observed in some astronauts raises the possibility of long-term, or irreversible changes. Optic nerve axons, once damaged, do not regenerate in humans. The retinal ganglion cells that give rise to these axons are neurons, and like other central nervous system neurons, they have limited regenerative capacity. If chronic intracranial hypertension causes sufficient axonal loss, the result is permanent vision loss. On Earth, untreated chronic intracranial hypertension can lead to progressive optic atrophy and blindness. The pressures astronauts experience are lower than those seen in severe idiopathic intracranial hypertension, but the duration of exposure is unprecedented. No one with mildly elevated intracranial pressure lives with it continuously for years. Astronauts on a Mars mission would. The Soviet Salyut and Mir programs, and later the ISS, provided the first long-duration data. Valery Polyakov spent 437 consecutive days aboard Mir, the longest single space flight. Soviet medical data from that era were less comprehensive than current NASA protocols, but Polyakov reported no permanent visual impairment. However, SANS was not systematically studied during his mission. The condition was first rigorously characterized in the 2000s, after ophthalmologic examination protocols were standardized on the ISS. Early astronauts may have experienced similar changes without them being formally documented. The cardiovascular system's failure in microgravity is a failure of adaptation, not a failure of the system itself. On Earth, the system is robust and highly adaptive. It adjusts to altitude, to dehydration, to hemorrhage, to heat stress. But it evolved in an environment where gravity was a constant. Every regulatory mechanism, every feedback loop, every compensatory reflex is tuned to operate under a 1G gravitational field. Remove that field, and the system doesn't switch to an alternative mode. It continues to operate using the same mechanisms, but the inputs are wrong, the outputs are maladaptive, and the result is a slow, progressive degradation. This is why exercise doesn't solve the problem. Exercise loads the musculoskeletal system, and that loading signal is sufficient to partially preserve bone and muscle. But exercise doesn't restore a hydrostatic pressure gradient in the vascular system. Running on a treadmill in microgravity loads your legs, but it doesn't pull blood into your legs the way standing on Earth does because there's no gravity to create the hydrostatic column. The baroreceptors detect central venous pressure, not leg muscle activity, and they don't receive the normal signals associated with posture and movement. Bed rest studies on Earth have been invaluable for understanding these mechanisms. Head down tilt bed rest, where subjects remain in bed with their heads 6 degrees below horizontal for weeks or months, simulates the headward fluid shift of microgravity without the expense or risk of spaceflight. These studies have shown that the fluid shift alone is sufficient to cause many of the cardiovascular changes seen in orbit. Subjects in bed rest studies experience reduced plasma volume, decreased orthostatic tolerance, cardiac atrophy, and in some cases, changes in vision and optic nerve morphology. The parallel between bed rest and spaceflight physiology is strong, which validates the use of bed rest as a ground-based analog and confirms that gravity, or its absence, is the primary driver of these changes. But bed rest isn't perfect. Subjects in bed rest are still in Earth's gravitational field. The spine is still loaded axially when lying down, and the inner ear's otolith organs still sense gravity. These residual gravitational cues may trigger compensatory responses that don't occur in true microgravity. Additionally, bed rest subjects can end the study at any time, while astronauts are committed to the duration of their mission. The psychological and physical stress of confinement in space, the exposure to radiation, the isolation, and the operational demands of spaceflight introduce variables that bed rest can't replicate. The inner ear's vestibular system is another component of the body's gravitational sensing apparatus. The otolith organs, the utricle and saccule, contain calcium carbonate crystals embedded in a gel layer overlying sensory hair cells. Gravity causes the crystals to press on the gel, deflecting the hair cells and generating neural signals that inform the brain about head position and linear acceleration. In microgravity, the otoliths experience no sustained gravitational load. The crystals float, and the signals they send are ambiguous. This is a major cause of space motion sickness, which affects approximately 70% of astronauts in the first few days of flight. Space motion sickness is acute and usually resolves within 48 to 72 hours as the brain adapts to the absence of otolith signals and relies more heavily on visual and proprioceptive cues. But the otolith system doesn't just contribute to balance and spatial orientation. It also provides input to autonomic cardiovascular reflexes. On Earth, tilting your head forward or backward changes the signal from the otoliths, and the brain uses this information to adjust blood pressure and heart rate in anticipation of postural changes. In microgravity, this input is absent, and the cardiovascular system loses a layer of anticipatory control. The loss of gravitational cues affects more than just the cardiovascular system. The musculoskeletal system relies on mechanical loading to maintain bone density and muscle mass. Bone is a living tissue that constantly remodels itself in response to stress. Osteoblasts build new bone in areas of high mechanical load, while osteoclasts resorb bone in areas of low load. This process is described by Wolff's law, which states that bone adapts to the loads it experiences. In microgravity, the bones of the legs, hips, and spine experience minimal load, and the balance between bone formation and resorption shifts toward resorption. Bone density decreases at a rate comparable to osteoporosis on Earth, approximately 1 to 2% per month in weight-bearing bones. Muscle atrophy follows a similar principle. Muscle fibers respond to tension by synthesizing new protein and increasing in size. Without regular loading, protein synthesis decreases, and muscle fibers atrophy. The muscles most affected are the anti-gravity muscles, those that maintain posture on Earth, particularly the soleus and gastrocnemius in the calves, the quadriceps in the thighs, and the paraspinal muscles along the spine. These muscles can lose 10 to 20% of their mass over 6 months in microgravity despite exercise countermeasures. The spine itself undergoes changes. On Earth, the vertebral discs are compressed by body weight, flattening slightly during the day and re-expanding at night when you lie down. In microgravity, the spine is unloaded continuously. The discs swell, the vertebrae separate slightly, and astronauts grow taller by 3 to 5 centimeters. This elongation is associated with back pain, which affects more than half of astronauts during their missions. The pain is thought to result from stretching of the spinal ligaments and altered loading on the facet joints, small joints between adjacent vertebrae. The elongation reverses upon return to Earth, but the back pain can persist for weeks. These musculoskeletal changes are significant, but they don't impair immediate function in the way that vision loss does. An astronaut with reduced bone density and muscle mass can still operate equipment, navigate, and perform tasks. An astronaut with degraded vision may not be able to read instruments, dock a spacecraft, or identify hazards. Vision is a primary sensory input for nearly all tasks in spaceflight, and its degradation is a direct threat to mission success. The question of whether SANS is reversible has been studied, but the data are incomplete. Most astronauts show some degree of recovery after returning to Earth. Optic disc swelling typically resolves within weeks to months. Choroidal folds and posterior globe flattening can persist longer, but they often improve over time. However, a subset of astronauts show persistent changes. Some have permanent hyperopic shifts requiring corrective lenses. Others have residual structural changes visible on imaging years after flight. The long-term outcome likely depends on the duration of exposure and individual susceptibility. Some people's optic nerves and scleral tissues may be more resilient to chronic pressure changes than others. Genetic factors may play a role. Studies have identified polymorphisms in genes related to collagen structure, vascular function, and fluid regulation that correlate with susceptibility to SANS. These findings are preliminary, but they suggest that not all astronauts are equally at risk. If genetic screening could identify individuals at high risk, mission planners could select crew members less likely to develop severe SANS, or they could implement personalized countermeasures. But genetic screening raises ethical questions and doesn't solve the underlying problem. It's a mitigation strategy, not a solution. The development of SANS also has implications for the selection of mission profiles. A Mars mission could be designed as a short-stay mission, minimizing time on the surface to reduce total mission duration, or as a long-stay mission, waiting for the next favorable orbital alignment to return. Short-stay missions are faster but require more fuel and expose crews to higher G-forces during propulsion maneuvers. Long-stay missions reduce fuel requirements but increase total time in space. From a SANS perspective, shorter total mission duration is preferable, but short-stay missions may not allow sufficient time for scientific objectives or for Martian gravity to provide any recovery from transit-induced changes. Nuclear propulsion, either nuclear thermal or nuclear electric, could reduce transit time significantly, potentially cutting the journey to Mars to 3 or 4 months instead of 6 to 9. Faster transits reduce cumulative exposure to microgravity and radiation, but they require technologies that are still in development. NASA's Nuclear Thermal Propulsion Program and other advanced propulsion concepts are being researched, but no flight-ready system exists. Even with faster propulsion, the surface stay and return transit would still total more than a year, ample time for SANS to progress. Another approach is to accept SANS as an inevitable consequence of deep space travel and plan missions around it. Crews could be trained to operate with degraded vision, using enhanced displays, voice interfaces, and augmented reality systems to compensate. Surgical correction of hyperopic shifts could be performed on Earth before or after flight, although this doesn't address optic nerve damage. Robotic assistance could reduce the need for precise visual tasks. But these are workarounds. They acknowledge the problem without solving it. The broader question is whether human physiology is compatible with deep space exploration without artificial gravity. The cardiovascular system's failure in microgravity is one of several physiological systems that degrade in space. Radiation exposure increases cancer risk and can cause acute radiation sickness during solar particle events. Psychological stress, isolation, and confinement affect mental health and crew cohesion. The immune system is suppressed in spaceflight, increasing susceptibility to infection. Wound healing is impaired. Pharmacokinetics, the way drugs are absorbed and metabolized, changes in microgravity, affecting the efficacy of medications. The cumulative effect of these stressors is a progressive degradation of human health and performance. Artificial gravity addresses many of these issues simultaneously. Restoring a gravitational environment preserves bone and muscle, maintains cardiovascular function, stabilizes intracranial pressure, and provides normal vestibular input. It doesn't solve radiation exposure or psychological stress, but it eliminates the single largest category of physiological risk. The question is whether the engineering challenge and cost of building a rotating spacecraft are justified by the reduction in medical risk. Given the current evidence on SANS and the lack of effective countermeasures, the case for artificial gravity is strong. The ISS was not designed to test artificial gravity. Its modular structure and orientation make adding a rotating section impractical. Future space stations, such as the planned Lunar Gateway or proposed commercial stations, could incorporate rotating modules or tethered designs. Ground-based prototypes could test crew adaptation to rotation, optimize rotation rates and radii, and develop operational procedures for transitioning between rotating and non-rotating environments. These tests are essential before committing to a deep space mission with artificial gravity as the primary countermeasure. The history of human spaceflight is a history of identifying physiological risks and developing countermeasures. Early astronauts experienced severe motion sickness until anti-nausea medications and adaptation protocols were developed. Bone loss was recognized in the 1970s, leading to the development of resistive exercise devices. Radiation shielding, dietary supplements, and psychological support protocols have all evolved through iterative testing. SANS is the latest challenge in this progression, but it's also one of the most significant because the countermeasures tested so far have been largely ineffective. The data are clear. The cardiovascular system, specifically its regulation of fluid distribution and intracranial pressure, is the first critical system to fail in deep space. It fails rapidly, within days to weeks, and the consequences worsen with time. The failure is a direct result of the absence of gravity, not a secondary effect of disuse or environmental factors. The system evolved to function in a gravitational field, and without that field, it cannot maintain homeostasis. This isn't speculation. It's documented in peer-reviewed studies, observed in hundreds of astronauts, and reproduced in ground-based analogs. The human body is an integrated system, and every system within it has evolved under the constant influence of Earth's gravity. The cardiovascular system's reliance on gravity is absolute. The fluid shifts, the baroreceptor reflexes, the venous return mechanisms, the cardiac output regulation, all assume a hydrostatic gradient that doesn't exist in microgravity. When that gradient disappears, the system doesn't adapt. It degrades. Understanding this isn't just an academic exercise. It defines the limits of human spaceflight. A mission to Mars, as currently envisioned, places astronauts in an environment where their cardiovascular system will fail to maintain normal intracranial pressure for the entire duration of the mission. The consequence is progressive optic nerve damage and vision loss, affecting the majority of crew members. This is the first system to fail, the fastest to degrade, and the one with the most immediate impact on mission-critical tasks. The solution exists. Artificial gravity, generated by rotation, restores the gravitational environment and allows the cardiovascular system to function normally. The engineering is challenging, but it's achievable with current technology. The alternative is to send crews into deep space knowing that their vision will degrade, their cardiovascular health will deteriorate, and their ability to perform essential tasks will be compromised. The choice is between accepting these risks or investing in the technology to mitigate them. The data tell us what happens. The measurements are precise, the timelines are documented, and the mechanisms are understood. The first system to fail isn't the one most people expect. It's not radiation sickness, bone fractures, or muscle wasting. It's the cardiovascular system's inability to regulate pressure in the skull, leading to swelling of the optic nerves and changes in the shape of the eyes. It begins within days, worsens over months, and in some cases results in permanent damage. This is the reality of human physiology in deep space. It's not speculative. It's not distant. It's happening now, on the International Space Station, and it will happen on any long-duration mission beyond Earth unless the root cause, the absence of gravity, is addressed. If you appreciate this kind of clear, evidence-driven explanation, subscribing and liking the video helps more of this content reach the right audience. You'll also find many other videos on the channel that follow the same approach.